Hi, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Dr. Amin Kaboli, a lecturer at EPFL, business consultant and executive coach. And I'm pleased and honored to welcome my dear friend and mentor, Professor Carlos Cordon, Professor of Supply Chain and Strategy of IMD Business School, that gave us time to be with us today. Thank you, Carlos, for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's interesting times, and it's very interesting to have discussion now that we see that the times are very uncertain and see how companies are reacting and what companies should and shouldn't do.
Thank you, Carlos. So to start with, how has COVID-19 changed the nature of what you do and how you do it?
Well, logically, as everybody else, we're doing a lot of teleworking. One of the interesting things is that particularly when you look at supply chains, you realize that the reaction has been extraordinarily different depending on the sector of the industry. You can take one example, anything that relate to products, disinfectant products, medical products, etc. Some of them had experienced increase in demand, which is huge. Others can take a soda company that on one side is selling through supermarkets, on the other side is selling through the HoReCa channel, restaurants and cafes. And then what happens is basically a switch from a big volume from one channel to another. And finally, other companies, you can think about car companies that not only the supply chain has been disrupted, but the demand is very much down. So a huge changes, a huge, I would say, level of uncertainty. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but a huge reaction about what digitalization means for supply chains. So very interesting times, I would say, although a little bit challenging.
Exactly, for us educators and then consultant for the business, but I know it's very difficult for companies that time for them that they're going through. IMF called that great lockdown, and it causes mother of crisis, which will end up definitely to economic recession. We are in economic downturn. We have some reports that China has showed like 3% positive, let's say for quarter two, but still we know that this investment is they are like basically for the governmental stimuli, and it's not by private sectors yet. And during corona outbreak, we experienced both supply and demand shocks, and still we are experiencing as well.
Yeah, well,
how do you see this?
Yeah, so to me, the interesting thing is that we look at the past, we look at outbreaks like these, at disruptions. We had the tsunami in Japan, we had the Thailand floods and so on. It was always in one part of the supply chain. I think that you're right. For the first time, we experienced both in both sides. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, a huge increase in demand, some cases going down. The reality is that most companies are preparing for a recession. And most companies are thinking about 2022 to recover. So what they see is a lot of companies doing a lot of contingency planning, and not only contingency planning, but planning basically we're going to go down in investments, we're going to go down in these and these. So that means basically that exactly as you say, in spite of economic incentive or by the governments, we are going to have companies and consumers driving massively down the economy. So we are certainly heading to a recession, and everybody's going to start cutting investment and consumers, unfortunately, cutting consumption.
Exactly. What we see right now is like we have governmental stimuli, like from United States, 3 trillion, from Japan, 1 trillion, European Union as well. And then we see like things are, people are investing, savings are still up. There's no doubt, because in any kind of economic downturn or economic recession, let's say, we have a high number of unemployment, high number of, for example, lower number of real estate, like lower rate in real estate, which is not at all this case. It's very different. This was mentioned by Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, 1 or 2 days ago as well in their letter to their stakeholders. So now, if we see this macro behavior and then go for each industry, which we see, we are observing and we are dealing with executives that they're saying you're suffering from demand and supply shock, when we're going to get over with this uncertainty in your view? Is it just vaccine the answer, or you see something else there?
No, I don't think that we are going to see that relatively soon ending, because one of the things that is happening is that all these fiscal or economic incentives are basically not creating in the real economy an increase in demand or an increase in production. On the contrary, we see the demand and the production contracting. So in spite of that, what we're going to see logically is a lot of debt increase by governments and so on. But at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for that, and we are going to end up with a recession. What is going to happen though, and that's going to be interesting to see, is that logically we're going to see governments spending much more in certain industries. We could expect a lot of more spending in healthcare and so on. You could expect that a lot of that money will go into that. We have seen now many countries in which the health system has not been strong enough, and they claim for more resources. They're going to get more resources. So that means all the industries associated with that are going to get growth. But all the others are going to basically get, on the contrary, they're going to get through a recession. So it's good. It's going to be different, I think, because exactly as you say, we're going to have parts of it that are going to be very much benefited from these incentives, and parts of it that are not going to do that. The typical example that you might find is, what about the tourism industry? Extremely hard hit, at the same time extremely protected by governments logically. You might see some reactions that are going to be very different. You may see some formats, some parts of it that are going to actually end up being very well, and some others that are basically collapsing. Many countries in Europe, they claim that around 1/3 of restaurants and bars are going to be definitively closed.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's what you're going to see. But at the same time, you see all the suppliers trying to, all the beverage manufacturers, I was seeing something about Moët Chandon was doing something, the LVMH tried to help all these HoReCa channels and so on to survive. So there we are going to see a lot of different incentives. And the problem for governments is going to be, how do we help the ones who need it versus how do we just put money in, and people who don't need it or are going to, or they profit from that, or even it's going to be unfair. Somebody's going to receive more than others. That's what we're going to see. And as a consequence, but I think that the recession is there, and I think everybody's preparing for that, is going to be long. This one, I think that because it's exactly as you mentioned, both the supply and the demand is going to be long. And we are seeing also a lot of companies extremely concerned about their suppliers and the supply base disappearing. And some others very concerned about the customers.
Exactly.
Many small customers that are going to disappear. So that's going to be what's going to happen. And then, as we were commenting, the digital, the online, the last mile, many of them are benefiting a lot. Some of them not, because the demand is not there. But you think about the Amazons, the Alibabas of this world, and certainly they are taking a huge boost from this situation.
Exactly. We see like the liquidity mainly goes toward bioscience, healthcare, and to tech mainly, but tech in a way that it helps the digital economy.
Yeah, and even the interesting thing is for me it was an interesting news that you have seen that the government in Greece, they were talking about the digitalization and the fact that they have used this as an opportunity to digitalize. Most likely somebody will qualify that as modernizing an old IT infrastructure more than making the country as digital as Slovenia. Mm-hmm. But certainly that will mean spending in tech and so on. And certainly also many companies, they have speed up their spending in digital. You see a lot of multinationals and companies that they say, we have done in 3 months what we were going to do in 3 years.
Exactly.
So a massive spending in infrastructure in order to support teleworking and to support remote working. So, and as a consequence also in other parts like cybersecurity and so on, a huge spending there. And that's creating certainly demand. So it's going to create growth in that part of the economy.
Exactly. I mean, and what we've seen at morning on the news as well, that for Twitter, we had some issue for high profile people, which intensifies the cybersecurity and the importance of digital technology. From the early days, definitely for genome sequencing in January, technology helped immensely, and specifically in pharma industry, specifically helping us. Moderna, Oxford, couple of other platforms, J&J, Medtronic, they're all submitting their, but it's very lengthy. And then for the audience who are not in the field of pharma, definitely it takes 10 years, the platform, to get the vaccine being approved. This is shortened to some 3, let's say, trials, and then fasten, let's say, the process going to be, or rushed up process going to be within 18 months, hopefully, if we get there. Technology really helped here. But if we're going to talk specifically about digital technology, like how digital technology really helped us to, during this time, during the Corona, let's say, disruption, to tackle with this disruption.
Well, I would distinguish two things. One part that helped a lot was the connectivity. The fact that many people had a kind of control tower, supply chain, in which they knew where the product was, they knew where demand was going. The part that didn't help at the beginning, particularly, was all the part of artificial intelligence, of forecasting and so on. So we know that forecasting is based on past data and is based on normal distributions. And when we have an event, something which is abnormal, even from a statistical point of view, we call it an outlier in statistics and we discount it. We say it doesn't count. So at the beginning, it was many companies were forced to disconnect if you want all these artificial intelligence forecasting. What was very beneficial was, on the contrary, the fact that they knew where the products were. What has been for me a surprise, I was talking about companies going from automatic to manual in order to do all these manual decisions about forecasting, about demand, and so on. The surprise for me has been that some companies have gone back in the middle of after several months, to almost semi-automatic by saying the challenge we had was that we needed to plan too many items that before were automatic. When we are doing that manually, actually, we are not doing as a good job as when you have a little bit of more data, just 1 or 2 months. Exactly. And then the forecast, again, helps a lot because it alleviates a lot the problem of planning of so many items. So that has been a little bit of a surprise. So it's the connectivity, I would say, what has helped a lot, and it should be pushed forward. And some of the artificial intelligence that at the beginning it didn't help, as time went on and there was a little bit more data, they helped in a kind of semi-automatic way to people to do a better forecasting and better planning. Also, something that has happened is that supply chain directors and executives, they have got a little bit their partners in IT to bring the money, to put the investments that they needed. So before it was difficult, now it was obvious. So logically, they got the money, they were putting that. So it has been an opportunity for many of them to say, okay, let's push ahead. So I have seen many supply chain executives being optimistic on the side of saying, let me tell you that this is going very well. Probably a bit over-optimistic, but given the circumstances, it was very helpful for them to have the investment. And for some companies, it has really paid off, and it has proven that investment, that it was not clear 6 months ago that it was going to be so important. Now, those who were a little bit in advance, wow, you could imagine some people thinking about teleworking in a factory. In some factories, you have this control room. Okay, why this should be in the factory versus almost at home? So a lot of companies have done a lot of work on that, and the IT investment has paid off fantastically here. Because, and that has been a surprise also, many workers were very concerned about going back to work. So I remember an executive leading heading a chemical factory saying, I have 50% of my workers who are so much afraid of the coronavirus that they don't want to come back to work. So the possibility of telling them, okay, you do a big part of your work at home has been very beneficial.
Exactly.
So interestingly mixed.
And at the same time, this means like security measures there definitely decreases the capacity extremely, like 60 to 70%. There are a lot of backlogs already. There are a lot of demand that part of it is they're lost, the lost sales. The other part is, for example, if we consider the luxury market or some watches, for some brands, they're in the waiting line, but this waiting line gets quite long now. Yeah. So that's true. Technology could help here, but I do agree, not necessarily. How can I say that? Yes, the infrastructure part of it, yes. Sensors, RFIDs, the other, yes. Like technically could help for logistics, but it could bring some visibility. But still, almost 50% of companies, they don't have any plan for their resourcing, like changing their source, and everything is happening basically in Japan, even not reshoring.
Yeah. So that was something very interesting because you mentioned Japan. It was when the earthquake happened over there. It was 9 years ago, and a lot of companies did learn a lot from that. I remember I even wrote a case about Philips, the Dutch electronic
Exactly.
company, how they reacted, the SWAT team they had, looking not just at their suppliers, but the suppliers of the suppliers, the tier 2, tier 3, and so on. So one would say, wow, they learned the lesson. They did a great job. Even they allow us to document it. But several years later, people forget.
But what is that? What is this? What is the reason that we are not learning? Because we document everything. In our societies, we have firemen, we have police forces, right? For any kind of crisis, they operate, they act in modern societies very efficient. But then in supply chains, we have model of them in society. We have documented events, but majority of companies, they don't do it. Why is it like this? Why don't we learn that?
I think that that's a very good question, but I think also that we need to remember that when you talk about firemen and so on, you talk about reinsurance companies, they do have a lot of events, they learn from that, they price that and so on. And this has been in specialized companies. I think that in supply chain, we have had some events, but we never had one like this. So if you think about that, you could say, well, instead of having one supplier in China or in Japan, let's have another one, maybe, I don't know, in South America, or maybe let's have another one in Eastern Europe. Then you have the lockdown and it doesn't matter. Basically, anything which is out of the country doesn't work. And so I think that they're one of the things, and you know that in supply chain, we talk about identifying the risks. There's been a lot of development over the last years about risk identification, mitigation, and so on. But this one, we have never seen that. And even I remember one supply chain executive who was saying, well, even if I had all these, he was saying, I'm in the car industry. There is no demand. I could have alternative suppliers. It doesn't help me. So I think that is the first time that we have seen that. It's also the case, I think, that slowly we have looked at those events, and the more usual ones that happen every few years, I think that many companies have developed some strategies. But those ones that are the big ones, nobody. And it is expensive. One of the things that's going to happen this time, I think, which is starting to happen, is that not the supply chain executives, but the board of the company are asking the CEO and the chief supply chain officer present us a plan about the sustainability of the business, about the reliability and the resilience of the supply chain. And I think it's for the first time that you see people at board level asking, what is resilience in a supply chain? How do I make sure that this is there? Because I have a responsibility in the company. And yes, before, if somebody asks for anything about that, we will say as a board, no money for that. Now it's a different view. I think it's this issue like, we are very young, you don't have health insurance in some countries until you have a problem with your health, then you say, oh, health insurance become a problem. It's important. I think that here we will see a maturity.
So exactly, that was the thing. I mean, I wanted to say, like, would you link it with the maturity of the organization, maturity of supply chain then, right?
I won't talk about maturity of supply chain. I will much more talk about the maturity, about the risk management in general. And I think that this risk, we have never seen that before.
Exactly.
It's like, for example, there was one concept years ago about de-risking China. It started in finance. It ended up in supply chain of global companies. They were saying, we cannot be so dependent on China. Very different reason. Not because China was not reliable, but because they said the factories you have in China should manufacture for China because the demand in China is growing. So how do we manage that? But I think that we will see a degree of maturity in that sense evolving, and almost a board level. At least I see several board members, several boards thinking about that and asking about that.
Yeah. And what is very obvious is shift in the mindset from efficiency to agility and resilience in supply chain. But then depends how companies are translating this resilience and efficiency. Still, many of them are money driven, and then they say like, no, efficiency is like being linked, or resilience is being linked. It's not that far from cost saving, but it's not necessarily cost saving. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that there we are seeing several changes. One is we see demand becoming much more niche, many more products. You go to, as I was saying, the beverage market, there is 50% more SKUs products today than 3 years ago.
Exactly.
So we see all this, and agility is a response to this demand from consumers about variety and so on. And there, I think that in supply chain, we have always looked at cost savings. And for the first time, we are looking at revenue that might be lost if we cannot fulfill. And this coronavirus crisis has shown exactly that. The biggest problem is not that you don't have supplies and then therefore you need to buy more expensive supplies. The biggest problem is that you lose the customer, you lose the consumer because you don't have product. The big issue was for many companies was not even to earn money. It was much more, we don't want the consumer to switch to another brand, to switch to another product. And if a product is not there, this is what they're going to do. So there I think that for the first time is being seen as revenue loss and is seen as reputation loss. And I think that this is where we need to look at that. Exactly as you said, as a kind of fireman, we need to make sure that there is no fire.
True, but then so far I observed there are three categories of behavior, or three cluster of behavior by companies. One is not reacting. Like they're just saying, like probably short term, they thought their assumption was probably is just like 1 month. Oh, well, it's not easy. Even in the world leader level, they consider that this is just nothing. It's another flu.
Another flu, yeah.
Exactly. So the second level was a midterm disruption. They said like, yeah, task force, but basically board level or senior executive level, they were not at all in task force. And still they are not, or they would say like, yeah, probably yes, but it's going to be finished. While we see like, again, we have a lockdown back in California, lockdown back by cluster in some other countries as well. And then there are another type of companies that they took it very serious from the very early day. And they brought the scientists up, and they really closely, they were just monitoring the case. How do you see this cluster, and how was your experience dealing with the companies?
So I think that the first class of companies, actually, that went out very fast. I think that the signals, if not because of the COVID-19, but because of the economic consequences of it. I think that many of them saw that. The ones that were thinking this will go up, I see companies doing a planning scenarios, a V, a double V, an L, an inverted L, and so on. All of them realizing that none of them will happen. They didn't know. I think that most companies, they are starting now to realize this is going to be for long term.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that they realized that probably in the last month, a little bit longer. But what happened is that this was realized at the top level, and until it went down, it has taken a while, particularly when you talk about very big companies, global companies. It's also the case that precisely because we have seen countries affected in different ways. Think about somebody operating in China. We see now, okay, there is a recession, it's obvious, demand for certain products is below, even 20, 30% below what was before, but is already there. So in that sense, they were expecting that. They say, okay, it was as we a little bit expected, we are already going out, still with concerns and so on. Now you put yourself in the US, it's a drama. It's basically totally, it's very difficult to foresee what's going to happen because the reaction of the authorities has been so discoordinated. Absolutely. And then you see some countries, some states locking down again. In Europe, I think that we could expect a little bit, basically a kind of recession with a slow recovery. And that's the biggest challenge, I would say. Some people thought by September this year is going to be ended. Now many people say, most global companies, they believe until 2021 this is not over. They have a global travel ban for the 2020. They are talking about people working from home. I think Amazon announced that last week. Everybody until the 3rd of January next year. If you don't need to come to the office, don't come. So I think that we see that. And I think in terms of supply chain, I think that the supply chains are becoming reactive, have been reacting in order to supply in spite of that. I think that for the first time, some of them are starting, we take the exception of industries like disinfectant and so on, they are looking at how do we change in order to fulfill the demand that is there. And some of them are planning reductions in capacity and so on. What for many of them has been a big surprise is the rise of online to an extreme that is huge. The big question is the consumer going to keep buying online or not? But certainly most people predict that many consumers are going to keep a behavior like that, particularly consumers that didn't bought online before, and now for the first time they have done that, particularly elderly consumers and so on. And suddenly they have found that very convenient. So it has been a golden opportunity for the online digital supply chain.
Exactly. How do you see it, Carlos? This shift, this disruption made a massive change, and specifically this massive change is around our way of living, commuting, working, right? So if we translate it for the companies, it's going to be like changing the consumer behavior. So do you see this? I know we cannot forestall anything, but do you see this more permanent, or do you see this longer term and probably gonna be a kind of habit later for the consumer, or in a specific industry going to be a specific let's say type of change?
But if we look at what happened in the past, people forgot very fast about crises and about events like this. Now, having said that, what it is also true is that some of the trends that we saw before have been accelerated. Typical example is consumers a little bit forgetting, going less and less to physical shops. And this is why you see a lot of retailers going bankrupt. Now, this was a trend that was there for 10 years, so it's not that COVID-19 has created that, but it has accelerated it.
Mm-hmm.
It has accelerated it also because from a business point of view, nobody wants to invest in real estate, in shops, when they know that the future is basically a degrowth on that area. So I think that there we see acceleration of some trends. I think that the consumer, and this is very difficult to say, as you say, depending on the areas, the sectors, is going to change. I think also that what has happened, the same way it has accelerated some trends, it has given the opportunities also to some digital initiatives to appear. And as a consequence, something that before for a new startup or a new idea in business, digital will take several years, now maybe months is there. And this is where you see a lot of the sharing economy, a lot of the click and collect, a lot of the, you think about something as simple as click and collect, many traditional retailers, they didn't do it. Now, even, you know what, the corner shop is doing that.
Exactly.
And you see all over the world, a lot of people doing that, which is surprisingly, which means that suddenly, and it's very difficult to say that, but suddenly big giants like Amazon or Alibaba might get competition. Why? Mm-hmm. Because you need the economies of scale to do that. Absolutely. Now, what happens if all of the retailers in one city, they sign for 2 or 3 platforms and they start to deliver online?
Online grocery, online, exactly, yeah.
You have seen restaurants that were closed, and then the chef wanted to, okay, I sell online. And suddenly the demand was, so, we live in Lausanne, there was one in Crissier. Exactly. He said, I'm going to deliver that online. And the demand was so big that it was unbelievable, it couldn't deliver. Now, does that mean basically that Uber Eats is going to be bankrupt? No, but Uber Eats is going to have competition, certainly. So exactly. This is going to accelerate this competition. And in supply chains, that's going to have a big impact, because then most companies are going to embrace and speed up the digitalization, not to be able to take advantage of these opportunities.
True. One topic comes here, I'm just driving it out of our discussion. Yeah. One topic that comes up here is local versus global.
Yeah.
Reshoring and offshoring. And of course, it's not by one click, but it's going to take some time. How do you see local versus global in supply chain?
So I think that there are two. I have seen two views being different. One is everything is going to become regional. Another is the Chinese version of it, saying no, this is not going to happen. Actually, the amazing thing is that both are right. Let me clarify that. You have manufacturing in China. You have a lot of assembly in China. And let's say that a country like a small country like Denmark or Switzerland, or even France, which is a small country, for them it is, then repatriate some manufacturing. Well, the effect for France is going to be huge. The effect for China is going to be minuscule.
Yeah.
Because China is so big. So actually what we saw already in the last 5 years was the idea of China for China, meaning exactly. All the assembly facility, everything we have there is for that. And then we are going to see a lot of reshoring, or I don't talk about reshoring, is much more new facilities being built here. As a global manufacturer, I need to have facilities, I need to balance that. Mm-hmm. Now, this crisis has signaled I cannot rely so much of my supply chain being global, I need to be regional in order to avoid shocks like this. At the same time, this is probably going to be with the new products. And because we have, as we mentioned before, much more niche products, or we are going to be much more agile, the advantages of countries like China and India will go down.
Yeah.
I always we talk about the example of Asara. And you know that they have the classic collection, which is the standard, is made in Asia. But the one that is fastly moving is made in proximity. It's made in Europe, it's made in Morocco and Turkey. We are going to see, I think, these kind of dual supply chains much more. And I think that this is the reaction we are going to get. So in that sense, both are right. Politicians in Europe and the US are going to claim factories are coming back and assembly coming back. True. Very automated, very digital.
Exactly, that's it. It's not going to add to the job market. Do you believe that?
I agree. It's not a big
more
thing.
Automated, less variety. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to be much more, I would say, precisely the high tech of part of that. And one thing that's important is, and people always misunderstand that, China is, they always claim that they were not so high tech. I remember when they complained, they say, you know, we assembled the iPhone, when we add, the value that we add is just the $10 of the assembly. The $290, the components are made in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan. So that's what it was 10 years ago. Now it has increased, but it still is there. So this is what we are going to see, I think.
It's a very good, very great point. One thing here is just one part I want to add is that both views are, I see them correct as well. Well, one thing here is that, for example, for high tech, there's no point to do for reshoring. But for footwear, for some other, let's say for apparels, definitely it makes sense to have some reshoring and add some reliability to the system or to the supply chain. Yeah.
But I will even take it further. You think about high tech and the supply chain, if you don't think just about the physical, but also the software and the design, then it's when you have the iPhone that, yeah, it's assembled in China, but it's designed in California.
Exactly.
And then if you look at the whole supply chain from design and so on, you will say, what is the biggest part of the value created?
Exactly.
Still
is it R&D or exactly?
Yeah. Many machinery that you think about, some Swiss manufacturers, they actually assemble the machines in China or in Taiwan. Most of the value added is still a big part is in Switzerland because they do the design, the engineering here. Exactly. So I think that there is where we need a little bit to make it a little bit bigger and to try to look at not the supply chain, but the value chain. What is the value being added?
Exactly. We have a question from the audience. What do you think of the future of automation given the required social distancing? Will it increase the trend of replacing human staff with machines?
I think that
no.
No, but it's an interesting question because of course it will accelerate, but it might happen a different thing, which is if you go and you are too young for that, and many of the things is that I remember being in a factory 30 years ago in a chemical factory. What happened at that time was this control room was being put in place because from a safety point of view of the workers was much more important. It's a chemical factory, there may be hazard and so on. We increase security and safety, but as part of that, we put them in a control room where they could manage all of this, and therefore it's going to be safe for them. And that was where automation, at that time, where sensors and so on, it helped a lot. I think that we're going to find the same. We are going to put a different emphasis on the type of automation we're going to have. And actually, it's going to help automation. It's going to help digitalization because suddenly, things that before you would say, well, if the worker is there, it's going to be cheaper or there is no big difference. Now, from a point of view of social distancing, as before it was about safety, we will put that level of automation.
Exactly.
So I think that there we are going to see a different one. One of the things that's going to happen, and that's going to be an interesting one to see, is the development, particularly from a safety point of view, about you could imagine running a refinery, a $1 billion facility remotely.
Yeah.
There you need a level of infrastructure and a reliability of the infrastructure, which is very high. And this is where you are going to see a lot of investments in IT to make sure that there is no problems, that there is a high level of
cybersecurity as well, as we can see more and more we have, this kind of attacks. One other thing here is that if you have, the question has the timeline of now and next probably 2 or 3 years or 5 years, but what I see is just like if we extend this timeline to for next 40 or 50 years, we don't have enough population even of workers probably to come to this work. And we see like the drops in the Western societies on the population. And then definitely we need AI, definitely we need automation and technology, because we don't have enough skillful laborers to work in future. But the timeline is like a little bit um, imaginative. It's above 10 or 15 years and so on. But this is another point. How do you see this one?
Well, no, I see that even happening now. So probably you know that there is a lack of truck drivers
True.
in Europe and in the US. So I always remember that when people 2, 3 years ago, when some of the companies like Tesla were saying we are going to be able
Cybertruck and
to get the Cybertruck autonomous driving, many companies were thinking, well, finally we will solve that problem. The reality is not there, and the reality is that still today we have a lot of problems. And you find a lot of the truck drivers in Europe, they come from Eastern European countries, because young people in Western countries, they don't want to do that job.
Mm-hmm.
The same in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the same with jobs in factories. There has been a lot of work by many companies about how do we digitalize the workplace to make it more attractive to the worker.
Mm-hmm.
And let me clarify that. Today you find, and I cannot mention the company, but I remember vividly going to a factory last year in which there were highly trained people in quality assurance. And of course, in the street, they go with their iPhone. They enter the factory, the quality facility, and then they start to use pen and paper.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they use a very good methodology, which is lean and all this, but it was like, oh my goodness. I could imagine I'm 30 something. I have a good degree on chemistry, pharmacology, and so on. And now I go entering from a 21st century, and that factor is the 20th century. So I think that we will see that a lot, just to make sure that we make it ergonomous and we make it attractive for the workers. And it's interesting that if you read old books from Toyota from the 70s, they were making robots because they said we don't have enough workers, or we cannot attract them in the factory.
Exactly. So you the bottom line is you see this 50 years probably to next 10 years or 15 years.
Yeah, it's going to be much faster. It's going to definitely be much faster.
Just 20 minutes, 20 seconds pause we take, we get back again.
Okay.
We can have a refreshment pause. I'm going to have my light as well on. I don't know why we have a sensor here.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we have another question, like two questions here. One is, look, there will be the different class. We are experiencing a different class here, class of workers. Those who are digital workers, that they can stay at home and they're happy of that, relatively. And those who are not digital and operational worker, which is the same as like at industrial age, we had everybody 8 to 5 or 8 to 4. They had to go to the factory, and then all of a sudden went like blue worker, blue collar, white collar, and then again we have this let's say gap between people. Digital workers, those who are in IT, banking, even in supply chain, on the not in the operation and production, more on the let's say sourcing, procurement. So how do you see this part? Because this is going to impact the salary level. This is going to impact finding talent, right?
Yeah. So that's going to be a very interesting one to see how it develops, because certainly there is people who like working at home alone, who like people who are very extrovert. They need the energy that gives the others. So it's interesting. You probably don't remember that, but years ago, Yahoo was a CEO who said, not anymore working from home. And even IBM, some years ago, they said, this is too much working from home. And now we see exactly the reverse. We might say maybe we have learned about how to do that. But I think that we are going to see also a lot of people who's anxious about not going out, not being physically there, and so on. So I think that we are going to see, and that's a job for many people will say HR, but I think for leaders, trying to basically find out a
Exactly.
good match between the type of job that people has and the type of environment. I think we are experimenting with a lot of different environments. I think that companies are surprisingly seeing how workers react to different remote things. So I have seen companies saying, we did get an intranet. We thought that it would be used, but we never thought that the use was going to be multiplied by 100 in 24
Exactly.
hours.
Exactly.
We see workers doing a lot, and then it has been a lot of, if you want, a kind of creating a community using digital tools. In some cases, some companies, the most important part has been that digital community among workers, among everybody else. To one extreme that somebody would say, well, this looks almost like Big Brother, but no, the companies didn't force anything. It was actually providing, reassuring people, and so on. You see a plethora of digital apps to help people to manage anxiety. I was working with a startup, which is not anymore a startup. They sold an app about meditation and so on to the New York healthcare department to help them to manage that. You see that being applied to organizations and to workers in a
Exactly.
lot of places. So I think that is going to be a huge development about how do we make sure that we understand the environment that people is working on, how do they feel, how they feel reassured, and so on. And if you think about supply chain, we have a lot of jobs that are physical, and we have a lot of jobs that actually you still need to be there.
Could be online, yeah.
It could be online. So that's going to be an idea of how do we match, how do we find these people, and how do we provide the environment they want. And I think that now precisely we are going to find a different twist. And I think that not only the jobs will evolve to take advantage of these opportunities, but also to fulfill the needs of the workers. How can we provide them with the digital tools that they will feel comfortable with? And I use one example, which is a very, very simple one. In supply chain, many companies have implemented Lean. And I remember I helped one company to implement Lean a few years ago. And suddenly it was a company with a lot of different places. And suddenly they realized they wanted to promote that. The buy-in of the work is very difficult. The cultural change is very difficult. It happened in spite of them because workers started to use WhatsApp. So the big question was, shall we forbid WhatsApp? It was no. Absolutely, Lean is about bottom up. Allow them to work on that. And I think that there, it's basically, we'll see a lot of these digital tools being used. And the surprise there, and that's another surprise, is that even people who was reluctant to use that, older people who were not digitally savvy, they started to use it. Still, we will have a significant part of workers who will be very reluctant to use digital tools. But that's always happened with any change.
So having said that, this is what we are observing these days for COVID app in Switzerland, which is like 1 million out of 8 million downloaded. 83 to 84% of people, they just say they're not interested to share their information, which I hope they get convinced to share. And anyway, we cannot expect to get immediate result because in South Korea, which is one of the very let's say successful case, took them some time to learn from Morse, change regulation, and then they were quite ready when this pandemic happened. They started to promote more this application. So let's go back, please, if you have any points.
No, I was going to say that in supply chain, we have sometimes the advantage that, of course, we don't deal with any personal information. And the idea is basically to help the worker to do a better job. So in that sense, it tends to be more positive. The negative side of that is what you have seen with Amazon, that people say, oh, Amazon is controlling how much do I work. And if I do work, if I do move. And then they took that on the negative side. It's like the boss always looking at me. Well,
true. Yeah, exactly.
Two sides. Yeah.
Exactly. Then we have another question from the audience. Airlines, cruises, hotel chains, basically, let's say in the hospitality industry, dining restaurants, how could they diversify when their core business is so heavily hit? It's a little bit
Well,
different.
that's not $1 billion question; it's $1 trillion question. I think that some of them are trying, but I think that the future is very bleak for them. I think that many of them, they're basically, these are industries that depend extremely on the load, on an airline, how many passengers do we have on the airplane, a hotel the same, and restaurants the same. I mean, these are relatively low margin business. They're very much depending on the demand and fulfilling and filling the plane of in the restaurant. So there, I think that we are going to see that. Now, diversification is what is happening right now. You see airlines sending more cargo, trying to do different
Exactly.
things. Hotels trying to do different things. Restaurants is the typical.
Hotels, for example, they're offering their rooms for work, like as an
Yeah,
offer for
exactly,
the others. Yeah,
exactly. And you see restaurants just delivering at home and so on.
exactly.
It's going to be very tough. It's going to be very tough because the consumer is still trying to understand what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that we will see that. It's the same having a dinner at home that having a dinner at the restaurant. Some people say yes, some people say no. I think that the consumer is very much afraid of traveling. And surprisingly enough, which is, and this is my opinion, a little bit absurd, they are less afraid of traveling within the country than crossing the country, which is a little bit strange because you would say, well, the virus doesn't know anything about countries.
Yes.
So you go to a country and maybe that city is very much a problem, whereas this area is absolutely no problem. So in that sense, to me, that's interesting, but still people feel that way. So I think, unfortunately, it's going to be very tough. I think that for them to is much more about how do we redo things. But there is another thing that is happening there, which is very interesting, which is this forces us to go back to the basics of business. Let me put one example. If a restaurant closes because they don't have enough money to pay for the real estate,
rents and
the problem that we have is the real estate owner, they don't know what to do with that real estate.
as well, exactly.
As well.
Which
So,
is saving the supplier of the
saving the
company.
supplier, exactly. So then is when you would say, well, wait a minute, is that a normal, a logical reaction? Because in a normal situation, okay, that restaurant is not paying not paying the rent. Therefore, I will put another thing. I will rent that to somebody else. But what happens if nobody is going to rent that? And you will see in many tourist locations, half of the bar, 1/3 of the bars, they are saying they're closing for good. And it's like, yeah, because they cannot pay the rent. But then is when you say, but what are the building owners going to do? Because they will have empty real estate. So that's going to play. Good question, difficult to answer. I think that they have a very tough time. I think that what they are trying to do, and it will make sense, is precisely to augment the product.
Exactly.
Marketing they call, which is not just the restaurant. Can we offer more to you for those who are willing to come? For those who want to use, can we offer more? And it's interesting that hotels traditionally, for example, they focus on the room and they didn't focus so much on the dining experience and so on from a overall point of view. Some hotels, of course, they focus on that. So maybe that is where they need to focus. The same with airlines. Should they at some point in time try to expand their offer and say, okay, we are going to offer you a full journey? That's a typical strategic reaction in many companies. When they find this situation, they try to expand and do the adjacent activities in order to enrich the consumer experience.
Or even changing the business model or turning it in a way that we had more seats and less space. We have more space, more security measures, but higher prices.
Higher prices.
And then we just take flight for something that really we do need, not with 20 Swiss franc going from here, I don't know, from Geneva to Barcelona or somewhere, which economically really doesn't make sense.
Well, but then is when you find precisely that those cities that receive the tourists, basically tourism is collapsing. So, it's a big dilemma.
And exactly what we see is a structural change. Yes. So, and until we are not done, I think until we are not done with this, we are all together in this issue, and until nobody feels safe or nobody is cured, nobody going to be here like feeling safe because the uncertainty going to be there. And the answer probably could be just having a vaccine, like hopefully next 9 months or 10 months.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
Hopefully, that will be the very, very good news.
that's a game changer. Exactly.
That would be a game changer.
Yeah.
Then we would be having a conference, a webinar like that, talking about going back to what we used to do before.
Then we're
And
going
it
to
will
meet each
be,
other. Yeah, in
it
person.
will be a conference, not a webinar. It will be face to
Exactly,
face.
exactly. So, Carlos, do you have? We talked about
Yeah.
the shift in the mindset from cost saving, from efficiency to agility and resilience. We talked about demand and supply shock. We talked about there are limited companies that they are learning and they are implementing implicit learning. They turn it to explicit and they document it and they have a proper task force team in place. We talked about, just you help me, the way of reaction to this disruption. Is there anything else you would like to add to all these discussions and all of these points that we discussed so far?
I think that there is a one effect that I have seen recently, which is interesting, which is the eagerness of people to learn.
Mm.
So if you think about this webinar, if you think about how many webinars executives have been offered, and it is still people, they have a Zoom fatigue, they have a lot of virtual conference fatigue, still they want to learn. And still they want to learn for one reason, because we are going back to basics with an institution like that. We need to understand why we're doing what we're doing. But I think that means basically, building on what you said, there is a willingness to learn and to build on the others. And I think that we're going to see much more of this chain of experience and try to understand. I think we are going to see much more of, we are in this together.
Exactly.
So therefore, yes, we are competing, but at the same time, we need to help each other. If not, this doesn't work. So I think we are going to see much more collaboration than before.
And co-opetition, your competition
Exactly.
and collaboration. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and cooperation. Good. Any last word, prediction, note, anything that you would like to share with us?
Well, no, because any prediction is very difficult to make, and for sure you're going to be wrong. Just a little bit of trying to say, there are a few things that I would like to observe, and
Sure.
maybe people could try to follow. I think that we talk about the online, what is going to happen with this world, with this digital.
Exactly.
I think that it's not just watching the big ones. I think it's also watching the mid ones or the small ones, because it could change. And I think also that we are going to see a lot of developments in the last mile, in the logistics and so on.
Exactly.
There has been a lot of talk, and I think that there is not just those involved in consumer products. I think it's going to drive the whole chain back. And that's going to have important repercussions. And finally, which is something that typically we don't look at in supply chain, we don't look at governments and what they do with their public policy. I think that for the first time, we are going to be very strongly affected by that, not because they are not basically taking in the past actions, because they are going to take many in kind of a rush. So I think that there, for the first time, supply chain executives, for the first time, they have been doing that, but maybe they need to do much more than that, informing politicians and governments about what are the consequences of what you do from a supply chain perspective.
Exactly. Thank you. Probably it's not far from reality if we say supply chain and logistic, after a very long time being in backstage, they got really on the priority.
It was in the news.
Exactly.
The heroes were not just the doctors and the healthcare people, but those delivering, the truck drivers. Exactly. They were heroes. Yes.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your time and joining us, despite all of the difficulties and all of the busy agenda that you have. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Amin. Great pleasure to be with you. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.